What would you do if the one abusing power wore the very uniform meant to protect justice? In an ordinary supermarket in the heart of Charlotte, a seemingly minor confrontation sparked a seismic reckoning. When a lieutenant colonel was humiliated in public, she didn't scream. She didn't fight with fists. She stood her ground with dignity and unwavering clarity. The story of Danielle Rivers doesn't just challenge your view of authority, it forces you to ask yourself, is your silence helping injustice grow louder? Watch until the end. Because sometimes one courageous step is enough to shake an entire generation. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on battlefields, but between the quiet aisles of a grocery store. Charlotte, North Carolina, a Saturday afternoon like any other. The March air was crisp but sunny enough to make people feel at ease as they stepped outside. In the southern part of the city, Meadow Hill Market was a familiar stop for the locals. The scent of toasted bread mixed with roasted coffee, the beeping of scanned items, and soft jazz playing from overhead speakers created an atmosphere of comfort and calm. Amid that rhythm of everyday life, no one noticed the middle-aged woman quietly walking through the entrance. She wore a plain white t-shirt, old but clean jeans, and unbranded sneakers. Her face, nearing 45, still held a certain strength-high forehead, steady eyes that seemed to have seen far more than others could imagine. Her long black hair was neatly tied back, her posture upright, her steps deliberate. That was Lieutenant Colonel Danielle Rivers, commanding officer of the Strategic Support Unit stationed at Fort Liberty. But today, no one recognized her, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Danielle cherished afternoons like this. No alarms, no urgent reports, no eyes demanding decisions. Just her and an empty shopping cart, walking through aisles lined with goods, picking each item with her own hands. Though she was a woman who could command a battalion or negotiate with international leaders, she still preferred to choose her own carton of milk, her own bag of almonds. Not because she had to, but because it was part of her freedom, a part she feared losing. She rarely had time for herself. 23 years in the military, a long road paved with discipline, loss, and ideals. But also, years marked by judgment, just for being a black woman in a system full of hurdles. Danielle was used to being doubted, but she was also used to never bowing her head. She was bending down to check the expiration date on a carton of almond milk when a sharp thump echoed beside her. A bottle of Gatorade had fallen to the floor, rolling a few times. A snack bag followed, bursting open, scattering chips across the white tile. The culprit? Greg Talbot, a police officer in uniform, about 6'2", brown hair, eyes as cold as a windshield. He looked at the mess, shrugged, and kept walking like nothing had happened. No bending down. No glance back. Danielle paused, not because of the chips, not because of the bottle, but because of the attitude. She knew what indifference in uniform could lead to. In the army, she had dealt with soldiers, like that she understood how small negligence could be a sign of much deeper disrespect. No shouting, no confrontation. Danielle simply took a step forward, her voice calm but clear. "Sir, you dropped some items. Maybe you should pick them up so no one slips." Greg turned around. His eyes skimmed Danielle like she was a defective item on a clearance shelf. For a moment, there were no words, only a stare. But in that look, Danielle felt three things: disdain, dominance, and warning. Then, his voice quiet but venomous. "Who are you again? Some store manager? Or just someone too bored with her own life?" The air in the aisle froze. A mother, pushing a cart nearby, paused mid-step. A worker stacking eggs looked up. A small act was becoming a confrontation. Danielle inhaled. Eyes locked forward. This wasn't the first time she'd been belittled. And it sure wasn't the first time she refused to back down. "I don't need to be anyone, but wearing that badge, you do." Her words weren't loud, but the calm in her voice made them cut like a blade. Greg laughed. Not a joyful laugh, laced with the confidence of someone who knew he had a badge, a uniform, legal authority, and believed that gave him the right to dismiss others. "Oh, please. Are you lecturing me about civic duty now? That's adorable." Danielle paused, not out of hesitation, but to keep the rising anger in check. She knew all too well that in this society, a woman of color raising her voice at a white officer would quickly be labeled as unhinged, as trouble, as provoking. But she also knew that staying silent meant letting a cop believe that disrespect was just part of the job. She took half a step closer, her voice lower. "No, I'm not lecturing you. I'm reminding you. Because if you forget this small duty, who knows what else you think you're above." Greg clenched his fists. His eyes darkened, no longer smug, now shadowed. The air around them thickened. People began to stop. Phones appeared. Eyes scanned for store security. Flashes of memory passed through Danielle's mind. A male colleague once saying, "You got lucky, girl, being promoted that fast." Or the icy stare of a superior when she suggested a tactical upgrade. "You sure your emotions aren't getting in the way?" Being a strong woman was never easy. Being a strong black woman was an endless, silent campaign. And now, in aisle 6 of a regular grocery store, another battle had begun. No guns, no fatigues. Just unshakable resolve and the eyes of dozens watching, deciding whose side they were on. Greg looked around. He saw the crowd. He saw the phones. Then came the half-smirk. "You recording this? Go ahead. Show the world how a cop gets harassed in public by a bitter woman who can't mind her business." Danielle stood still, not out of shock but because his words were living proof of what she had always warned against. Some wear a uniform to cover weakness and cruelty. She didn't yell. She didn't argue. She simply said, "You're not being recorded because you're a cop. You're being recorded because you forgot to be human." The air suddenly felt frozen. A man nearby took a step back. A child whispered to his mom, "Mom, is he gonna get in trouble?" Danielle stood tall. Her hands relaxed at her sides, as if she were standing on a training field. "I don't expect you to respect me because I asked. I expect you to respect the badge you wear." Greg hesitated. His arrogance dimmed, now replaced by discomfort and caution. What some had assumed was a minor dispute now carried real weight. Danielle pulled out her phone, not hurried, not shaken, her hands steady. "I'd like to report a situation of officer misconduct at Meadow Hill Market." "Yes. I have video and multiple witnesses." "I'll wait here." Greg stepped forward, eyes blazing. "You think you're scaring me?" Danielle met his stare, unwavering. "Remember, I think I'm finally holding you accountable." A siren wailed in the distance. The crowd shifted slightly, but their gaze held firm. A store employee whispered into a walkie-talkie. An elderly woman touched Danielle's arm, said nothing, just nodded. A nod full of weight. It was the nod of someone who had once been insulted, once dismissed, but never brave enough to speak up. Danielle knew this was no longer just about her, no longer about a fallen bottle or a disrespectful remark. It was a moment to define where justice stands, and who has the courage to name it. She stood still. No more words were needed. Those around her began choosing sides, not with shouts, but with glances, silence, and phones raised. Greg saw it all, and for the first time, he took a step back. The supermarket door swung open. Afternoon light poured in, slicing through the tension. Local officers entered, followed by a man in a navy blue suit, Mayor Henry Clarkson. Danielle didn't turn. She stood tall, just as she had during every parade and inspection. Greg? He didn't move. His eyes scattered. The rest of this confrontation would no longer be personal. It would be a moral verdict on the abuse of power. No one could have predicted that a shattered snack bag on the supermarket floor would be the curtain raiser for a confrontation that would shake the entire city. Just seconds after Danielle turned to reach for a carton of almond milk, a soft noise echoed from the aisle to her right. Thump, crinkle, a green Gatorade bottle rolled across the white tile, bumping into the foot of a nearby child. The snack bag that followed burst open like shards of potato glass scattering across the ground. The man responsible was none other than a tall, uniformed police officer with a swagger in his step. On his left chest, a silver nameplate read, "Greg Talbot." He stopped for barely a second, glancing down at the scattered items, then walked on as if nothing had happened. Danielle froze, eyes following the retreating blue uniform. She wasn't the type to nitpick over small things. But what made her stop wasn't the bottle, it was the attitude. That cold indifference she'd seen too many times inside the system. In the military, if a soldier dropped something and didn't pick it up, it wasn't just carelessness. It was a sign of disregarding consequences, of disrespecting those around him. Small habits, left unchecked, became toxic cultures. Danielle knew that all too well. She stepped forward, unhurried. Her voice was calm, clear, and free of judgment. "Sir, you dropped something. It's a bit messy down there." Greg turned around. His gaze swept across Danielle as if sizing up a sales clerk who had just ruined his mood. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then a faint frown surfaced. "Yeah? Not my problem. Some janitor will handle it." His words weren't just a dismissal. They exposed a mindset that responsibility belonged to someone else, and he didn't need to care. Danielle stood tall. Not to intimidate, but as a natural reflex of someone trained since 19. She looked Greg in the eye. Not with anger, but with unwavering steadiness. "You're wearing a badge, officer. What you do, even in a supermarket, is being watched. By kids. By people. Picking up what you dropped. It's not about trash. It's about respect." Greg squinted. A half-smirk formed. There was nothing shameful in itonely arrogant mockery. "Lady, are you seriously lecturing me over chips? You got too much free time, huh?" A young couple nearby started paying attention. A teenage employee arranging bread on the shelf paused mid-motion. No one spoke. But the way they looked at the two of them, it was clear this wouldn't end here. Greg scoffed, shrugged, and turned away. But after taking just 3 steps, he spun back, voice flat and cold. "Next time, keep your manners to yourself." The words, seemingly offhand, landed like a slap in the face of someone who had given nearly her entire youth to her country. Not because of who she was, but because the man before her didn't care who she was. Danielle stood still. Her heart slowed, but her mind echoed with memories. Being pulled over for driving a nice car in the suburbs at night. Being asked to prove her rank while wearing full uniform. Being whispered about by her peers as an affirmative action decoration because they didn't believe she'd earned her promotion. And now, in a small supermarket, all that pain came rushing back wrapped in a dismissive phrase, a contemptuous glance. Greg turned the corner, unaware that all eyes were now following him. Danielle turned, bent down, and picked up the bottle, not because she was told, but because it was the right thing to do when someone else had forgotten their dignity. She tossed the snack bag into the nearest bin, then quietly wiped the spilled drink with tissues from her purse. A small act, but it made the entire aisle fall silent, as if someone had just struck a drum inside their chests. An older woman to her left whispered to her husband, "That's what dignity looks like." Not the badge. The action. A college student nearby lifted his phone not to film Danielle, but to record in the direction Greg had just disappeared. Something had shifted. And Danielle knew if she stayed silent again, the system would keep teaching people that silence is wisdom and speaking up is trouble. She decided she wouldn't let that happen. But the ordeal wasn't over yet. Greg Talbot, after rounding the corner of the aisle, suddenly stopped. Maybe he felt insulted by a stranger, by a woman daring to call him out. Maybe his pride was bruised by a silent crowd that wasn't as invisible as he'd hoped. He turned back slowly, as if savoring the moment of confrontation, locking his arrogant gaze onto Danielle. "And who are you to tell me what to do?" Greg asked, his tone sharp and cold. There was no hint of remorse, no sense of discomfort for the mess he'd made. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement toward her polite reminder. All that appeared on his face was mockery and contempt, the kind of reaction all too common in those used to wielding power without being challenged. Danielle wasn't surprised. Deep down, she'd encountered this before: men who believed their uniforms placed them above accountability. But her eyes grew firm, now no longer gentle. Like the look she'd give a defiant soldier back at the base, Danielle held her gaze, calm on the surface, but a quiet force churned beneath. "I'm just someone who believes respect shouldn't be optional," she answered, each word crisp, especially for someone wearing a badge. A few people nearby started whispering. No one raised their voice, but the air had shifted. The tension between them was no longer a fleeting moment. It had begun to draw attention, eyes, ears, and opinions. Greg crossed his arms, a smug grin curling on his lips. "You think because you talk nice and stand tall, you get to act like you're in charge here?" He stepped closer, voice louder. "Let me guess, you're military or something." "That explains the attitude." Danielle didn't respond right away. She had heard jabs like that before, sometimes from subordinates, sometimes from commanding officers. But each time, she chose to preserve her dignity, because she knew if emotion took over, the truth would be lost. "Does it matter?" she asked, voice still as a lake. "Or are you just uncomfortable with being held accountable?" Greg smirked again, a look any woman who's ever been belittled in the workplace, in the community, or even in her own home, would recognize instantly. It was the smile of someone who wasn't listening, just waiting to dismiss. "You're nobody," Greg said, voice like steel. "You're just a woman in a store pretending to care. But you don't matter. Not here, not to me. So stop acting like you do." The words sliced through the already tense atmosphere. Danielle didn't flinch. But inside, her heart tightened. Not from pain, but from recognition. Too familiar was the feeling of being judged, not by merit, but by skin color, by gender, or simply by eyes that refused to bow. She stepped forward. Not to threaten, but not to retreat either. "I'm not pretending. I care because I've seen what happens when people stop caring." Greg tilted his chin toward her. "This isn't war, lady. You're not on the front lines, so stop acting like some damn hero." Danielle stood firm, but her eyes sharpened. Gone was the polite gaze of a casual shopper. In its place was the stare of a soldier who'd once stood between life and death decisions, who'd chosen sacrifice for others, and who'd been betrayed by the very people she protected. In that moment, everything in the supermarket fell still. No barcode scans, no rolling carts. Just the two of them separated by a few feet, and a wall of prejudice being silently challenged. "War isn't just on battlefields," Danielle said, her voice low but echoing. "It's in moments like these when people choose silence over principle, when power forgets humility, when uniforms become excuses." Greg laughed aloud, loud, forced, still clinging to arrogance. "Is this your TED Talk? You want applause now? Sorry, lady. I don't do politics. I do law enforcement." A middle-aged man nearby, standing with his young daughter, pulled out his phone, not to call anyone but to record. He, like many others, could feel this moment wouldn't end easily. Danielle didn't react. Her gaze never wavered, as if none of Greg's words had chipped away at her composure. "If you can't tell the difference between politics and human decency," she said, shifting to English for the first time with deliberate clarity, "then maybe you're in the wrong profession." Greg frowned. For the first time, his face lost its total smugness. There was something in Danielle's voice, perhaps the steadiness, or a power that didn't need volume, that made him take a mental step back. "You better watch yourself," he growled. "People get in trouble for messing with cops." Danielle tilted her head slightly. Her stare razor sharp. "Only if the cop forgets who he's supposed to be." That final line rang like a bell in the minds of everyone nearby. It echoed as a reckoning. An older woman whispered, "She's right." A young man muttered, "That guy's digging himself deeper." And as Greg remained frozen, Danielle calmly took a single step back, not out of fear, but because she already knew what was coming. This moment wasn't the end, it was the beginning of truth unraveling. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to flash credentials. She didn't need to wave a military ID. She only needed to stand her ground and let Greg expose everything collapsing within himself. But that disdain was only the surface of an undercurrent waiting to erupt. Greg Talbot hadn't even taken a step before Danielle spoke out loudly, not hastily, but with each word carrying a quiet force, like waves beating steadily against a cliff. If you wear that badge, then you represent something, not just yourself, the force, the system, the people who believe in law and fairness. Greg stopped, slowly turning back as if her words hadn't touched him at all. He crossed his arms, shrugged, wearing the look of someone who'd just heard a comment about the weather. You're just a woman. Mind your business. The last 3 words, mind your business, weren't advice. They were a carefully sharpened blade, meant to slice into her dignity. The phrase sounded familiar because Danielle had heard it too many times in her life. But this time, beneath cold fluorescent lights and a crowd silently turning away from silence itself, she knew she couldn't swallow those words like she had before. She stepped forward, closing the distance, slightly not to threaten, but no longer staying in the safe zone. Her gaze wasn't harsh, but sharp like a scalpel cutting through the posturing in Greg's eyes. I'm not just a woman, Danielle said, her tone steady and firm. I'm a citizen, a soldier, a leader, and unlike you, I know that every uniform comes with a weight off duty, not arrogance. Greg rolled his eyes, trying to maintain a bored expression, but his brow twitched. Danielle noticed it immediately, the way only someone trained to read the eyes of enemies at night could. You finished? Greg asked, his tone less mocking now, shifting to something more defensive and rigid. Danielle answered with a sentence that landed like a command. Number you are. The air inside the store began to shift. A couple paused near the produce section, no longer interested in vegetables. A mother placed her toddler in the shopping cart, pulling out her phone not to text, but to open the camera. A college student in a hoodie pulled out his phone, adjusting his angle. What began as a minor disagreement had become a focal point. Everything unfolded in silence, but it was a particular kind of silence, the kind when witnesses begin choosing their place in the history of a moment. Greg sensed it. He raised his eyebrows, scanned the crowd, then turned back to Danielle. So now we're putting on a show, huh? He scoffed. Lady, you picked the wrong guy for your little social experiment. Danielle said nothing. She knew that at this point, every word could cut like a weapon, and silence, used wisely, could go deeper than any blade. A young woman stepped out from the fruit aisle, quietly moving closer. She said nothing, simply stood behind Danielle as a sign of solidarity. A man in a blue button-down shirt by the soda shelves stopped his cart and pressed record. These quiet gestures rippled outward, transforming the supermarket aisle into an arenanot of noise, but of principle. Greg looked around, realizing he was now surrounded by eyes that were no longer neutral. He tried to strike back with a threat. All of you think you know the law, huh? Filming people without consent? You want to play judge and jury now? An older man nearby responded, calm but sharp. We're not judging, we're witnessing. The simple sentence made Greg exhale sharply. He took a step back. Danielle was no longer facing just a police officer. She was facing a symbol of unchecked authority, normalized bias, and arrogance cloaked in uniform. And behind her, no one shouted. No one cheered. But every phone recording, every steady gaze watching, was proof that she wasn't alone. Greg tried to regain ground with a tone tinged in threat. You know I can call this in as a disturbance, right? You're interfering with a law enforcement officer. Danielle tilted her head slightly, her voice slow and deliberate, each word nailing itself into the air. What you're doing is not law enforcement. It's ego management. And trust me, I've managed bigger egos in battle zones. A chuckle rippled through the crowd, not loud, not chaotic, just enough to pierce the tension at the perfect time. Greg flushed, his fists clenched, but he didn't step forward. For the first time, he was no longer in control of the conversation. Danielle lowered her voice, just enough for Greg to hear. I didn't come here to fight you, but I also won't walk away just to make you feel untouchable. That time is over. Greg swallowed hard. He took a step back not out of fear, but because Danielle's composure unsettled him more than any scream ever could. A few people in the crowd began nodding. A young boy whispered to his mom, "She's not scared." No one in that store realized they were witnessing a small historical memento moment when justice didn't arrive with a gavel, but through the fearless eyes of a woman who refused to stay silent. The tension was no longer between two people. It had seeped into every corner, reflected in the lights above, etched onto the faces of everyone choosing to stay, observe, and remember. And in that atmosphere where pride was tested, where power was questioned, where the public had stopped being spectators and become witnesses, Danielle knew she had crossed into a place of no return. But she didn't tremble. Not even slightly. Because she knew once the truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. And once light has touched darkness, it always leaves a trace. But the ordeal still wasn't over. While most confrontations tend to end with someone backing down, this time, things were only just beginning. There was no sign of concession, no apology, no bowing of the head from the one who should have set the example. As phones stayed raised and eyes continued to watch with growing intensity, Greg Talbot stood his ground, desperately clinging to the power slipping from his grasp. Danielle did not retreat. She didn't raise her voice, nor did she appear aggressive. But it was her calmness that Greg couldn't seem to control. In her voice, there was no defiance, only something that sounded like an unignorable moral question. "It's not about who I am," she said, eyes locked on Greg's. "It's about who you're supposed to be." That moment seemed to freeze the entire store. No sound of shopping carts. No background music, usually omnipresent in large grocery stores. Only the heavy breathing and rapid heartbeats of the people witnessing the scene. Greg let out a laugh, but it wasn't genuine. It was stiffer to cover his rising discomfort. "You think that makes you special?" He scoffed. "You think throwing around big words makes you righteous?" Danielle furrowed her brow, unfazed by the mockery. This wasn't the first time she'd been dismissed. She'd heard similar lines back when she was the only black cadet in her officer training class. She'd faced doubting eyes during high-level strategic briefings where her proposals had to be twice as thorough to be seen as valid, but that never made her weaker. On the contrary, it forged a kind of strength no one could take away. She responded, every word drawn from deep within, "I don't need to be special, I just need to be human, and what I see right now is someone forgetting what it means to be one." Greg flinched slightly. The words sounded gentle, but pierced directly through his pride. A pride built not on responsibility, but on the habit of going unchallenged. He clenched his jaw, speaking lower, colder. "I don't answer to people like you." Danielle tilted her head, her voice soft but resonant like a bell. "Then maybe that's the problem." A soft wow came from someone in the crowd. A white man in his 50s gave a subtle nod. A young woman removed her earbuds, entirely the real-world scene, now more captivating than any song. The tension filled the aisle between two shelves. Every eye was fixed on the standoff, one in a police uniform, one in civilian clothes radiating the presence of someone who'd stood on battlefields. And if a choice had to be made, most had already silently sided with the latter. Greg could feel it, and rather than diffuse the moment, he tried to dominate it. "Keep pushing, and I'll call this obstruction. You're interfering with a law officer in duty," he growled. Danielle didn't blink. "You're not on duty," she replied. "You're just shopping, and what I'm interfering with is your ego." That line hit like thunder, shaking what little power Greg had left. A nearby woman let out a short laugh, not of humor, but of recognition at the cold precision in Danielle's words. Greg stepped forward. Not too close, but enough to make the crowd hold its breath. "Back off," he said, voice pressed low, like a forced command. Danielle didn't move. She stood tall as if inspecting troops, her eyes on Greg not as a woman looking at a man but as a citizen confronting an officer misusing his authority. "Respect is not optional," she said, her tone not loud, but clear enough to echo in the stillness. And intimidation only works when the other side is afraid. I'm not. Greg trembled slightly. A twitch in his fingers, a broken rhythm in his breath. It was the telltale sign he had lost control. And worse, he knew it. He turned away, trying to hide the sting of humiliation. But behind him, the cameras kept rolling. Every step backward, every side glance, every word from Danielle was being preserved. Not just on memory cards, but in the minds of everyone present. A voice rose from the right, a middle-aged woman, not loud but clear enough to spread. Thank you for standing up. Danielle didn't turn, but nodded gently. She didn't need applause, but she knew in every silent crowd there is someone waiting for a voice before they find their own. Greg stood frozen, not because he didn't know what to do, but because he was trapped between ego and the realization that he had just lost. He knew that one more word could cost him everything. But silence wouldn't save him either. Danielle stepped forward, not to close in, but to affirm her place. You don't have to like me, but you will respect this moment, because it's bigger than both of us. And she was right by now. This was no longer a personal conflict. It had become a mirror reflecting the system. Greg represented the everyday abuse of power, cloaked in uniform. Danielle represented those who had long been disrespected, overlooked, and silenced, but who now chose not to bow. And the crowd, unintentionally, had become the silent jury of a moral courtroom right there in aisle 4. But the ordeal wasn't over. After Greg was pushed back by Danielle's sharp and unwavering words, no one spoke. There was no applause, no cheering. Instead, there was a strange kind of silence from apathy, but because those witnessing the raw truth didn't know what to do with it. The crowd began to gather. People, in small clusters, stood along the aisle between the shelves, maintaining their distance as if watching an intense play they dared not interrupt. Each wore a different expression, some thoughtful, some frowning, others simply still, holding up phones that glowed faintly against their faces, like tiny mirrors reflecting their inner hesitation. Danielle stood at the center, motionless. She could feel every heavy breath in the room. Her gaze, no longer focused solely on Gregget, began sweeping across the faces around her. In her eyes was no plea for help, only an unspoken message. I stood up. Will you? Greg remained silent, his eyes beginning to shift. He no longer spoke, perhaps, because he realized that any further word could be used against him. And yet, he didn't apologize. He didn't retract. That silence, combined with his defiant stare, created a different kind of pressure that fell squarely on the shoulders of everyone watching. A young college student, maybe 20, holding his phone, stepped back slightly. He looked at Danielle and at Gregthen back at his screen. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Beside him, an older woman shook her head. No one had to say it, but they all knew. This wasn't just between two people. This was a test for the whole community. Danielle could feel it. She knew that silence kills justice faster than lies ever could. She'd seen it on the battlefield when fellow soldiers stayed quiet instead of defending what was right. The consequences were brutal. And now she was seeing it again in a quiet supermarket, where anyone could speak up, but most chose the safety of silence. She took a deep breath. Not to cough, but to stay focused. She was all too familiar with this feeling, standing alone under a sea of stares, waiting to see who would be the first to break the barrier of silence. Greg glanced around, then muttered a sarcastic remark, not loud, but clear enough to carry through the space. What? Now she's the hero. This your moment, huh? Enjoy the spotlight. He tried to laugh, but the sound was hollow. It wavered like a door trying to stay shut while the wind forced it open. Danielle didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because in that instant, a middle-aged woman near the produce section spoke up, her voice soft but steady. Number, she's just doing what we should have done a long time ago. The energy in the room shifted immediately. A quiet, yeah, rose from the far right corner of the store. A delivery worker in uniform mumbled. Finally, someone said it. These were the first verbal confirmations, and like all truths, once spoken, they didn't stop. A tall man in his 40s stepped forward. He said nothing, simply stood beside Danielle, his eyes locked on Greg. A mother holding her baby restarted her recording not to capture the confrontation, but to document the support rising around it. The entire atmosphere had changed from tension to resolve. Greg stepped back. His initial confidence had evaporated. He looked at Danielle then, scanned the room as if searching for someone, anyone, who would take his side. But no one moved. Only the silent gazes of those who had once said nothing now speaking through their presence. Danielle turned to the woman who had spoken and gave a small nod. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. Because what mattered wasn't the support for her but the awakening of a community that had long been lulled into silence. She stepped forward, her eyes on Greg no longer challenging, but simply truthful. You see? This isn't about me. This is about everyone here who's been watching people like you walk away from accountability. Greg said nothing. His silence no longer held the weight of authority. It reeked of total loss of control. A store employee approached Young, slightly unsure, but eyes focused. "Ma'am, do you want us to call someone? Internal affairs?" Danielle looked at the boy, then gave a quiet nod. "Yes, and record everything. This is no longer a conversation, it's documentation." Greg took another step back, but he didn't leave, because he knew if he walked away now, every video, every stare, every testimony would only make things worse. He was trapped not by anyone else's actions, but by the shadow of his own. Danielle stood still. But inside, she was anything but calm. Old memories surged back of times she'd spoken up but was ignored, of defending justice and being labeled troublemaker. But this time was different. This time, she was not alone. And in the eyes around her, she knew, those who once chose silence had now been awakened. Not because of who she was, but because truth, when spoken, holds the power to shatter fear. Just as the atmosphere in the supermarket shifted from silence to support, Greg, perhaps realizing that his authority was being eroded by every stare and raised phone, suddenly snapped, his voice no longer calm. "I can get you out of here in a second." No one was surprised, but everyone stopped breathing. That sentence felt like a last-ditch defense from a man used to wielding power as a shield against accountability. Danielle, still rooted in place, didn't flinch or frown. She simply turned slightly toward Greg and answered with a cold, composed line, "And I'll let the law decide if you can." Her words weren't loud, but they struck directly at the heart of the matter. Authority doesn't grant immunity, and no one, not even a police officer, is above the law. Greg stepped back slightly, eyes flickering, though he tried to maintain his rigid expression. But Danielle didn't hesitate. She reached into her pocket for her finino drama, no rush. The movement was calm, deliberate, like someone completing a protocol they knew by heart, a routine response from a citizen who understood her rights. The supermarket air held still. All eyes focused on the hand scrolling through her contacts. No one tried to stop her. In fact, a few stepped closer, falling silent to catch every word that followed. Danielle dialed. No search was needed. The number had been saved, and that said everything. She had come prepared. Not because she wanted confrontation, but because she understood that people like her, black, female, and unafraid to speak truth, must always be ready to prove they are not alone. The call connected. A dispatcher's voice answered. Danielle responded with clarity and calm authority. "My name is Lieutenant Colonel Danielle Rivers. I am currently at Meadow Hill Market in Charlotte. There is an Officer Greg Talbot, threatening to remove me from the premises for addressing inappropriate conduct. I am requesting immediate contact with Internal Affairs." Greg froze. Her tone didn't waver. There was no emotion in her words. Each sentence was tight, focused, and undeniable, spoken with the poise of someone trained to be exact, shaped by military code. The voice on the other end replied, "Ma'am, is there a risk of physical escalation?" Danielle answered plainly, "At this point, no physical aggression, but his words are recorded, so is the crowd." The dispatcher acknowledged her report. Their voice became more cautious, more official. Understood. A supervisor and a legal observer will be dispatched immediately. Danielle nodded. Thank you. I'll remain on site. She hung up, set her phone down on a nearby counter camera still rolling, then turned back to Greg. No accusations, no smugness, just a look. One that said, I don't need to shout, the truth speaks for itself. Greg took a deep breath, trying to regain composure, but the room was no longer on his side. A young man in a blazer murmured, Sir, maybe you should stop talking. A woman by the dairy section whispered to her husband. She knew exactly what to do. That's not the first time she's had to protect herself. Danielle remained silent. She had done her part, called the right people, followed the right steps, respected the process. Now it was up to the system, the same system Greg had once believed would always protect him, to prove whether it still served justice or simply shielded privilege. Greg looked around, searching for a way out. But there wasn't one. Every direction from the store entrance to the checkout lanes was lined with people watching. And this time, their eyes, no doubt. No fear, only something closer to accountability. A little boy standing behind his mother's cart whispered, Mom, is he in trouble? She replied, He should be. A siren echoed faintly in the distance, not loud, but unmistakable. A patrol car had just turned into the parking lot. People near the glass entrance began murmuring. Greg paled. Danielle didn't move. Everything was unfolding exactly as she expected. Nothing was surprising except for one thing. For the first time, no one looked away. She exhaled softly, not from relief but as a way to keep herself grounded. She knew this was far from over. But through her actions, she had done what many had longed to see. She had turned justice from a concept into motion. Greg stood silent, his arms slack, his gaze scattered. And in that moment, just as the police cruiser rolled to a stop at the door, the crowd inside the store began to part. Not as spectators, but as people making space for the truth to enter. No one expected that a single phone call would shift the entire atmosphere inside the supermarket. But the moment Danielle set her phone down and turned to face Greg, it became undeniable the balance of power had begun to shift. The eyes that once looked hesitant or cautious were now clearer, firmer, no longer filled with fear, but with the gaze of those witnessing something they had long hoped for, transparency. Greg tried to stand tall, but no one missed the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. After Danielle stated her military rank, backed by dozens of witnesses and recording devices, the arrogance he once wore like armor began to crack like ice melting under the April sun. He turned his head toward the supermarket entrance, and at that exact moment, the sound of a police siren rang out. Not loud, but just enough to draw every eye in the room toward it. It wasn't just the signal of arriving law enforcement. It was the sound of power beginning to shift. Greg blinked rapidly. There was something in the way he looked down at his hands as if he had just unknowingly pressed a self-destruct button. Sweat gathered along his temples, despite the store's cool, steady temperature. The man who had just threatened and postured now looked like a student waiting to be called on by a strict teacher. Danielle didn't move. Her face remained calm, almost still. But inside, her heartbeat pulsed heavily. She wasn't anxious out of fear. She knew this was the edge of something fragile about to tip into something irreversible. One more second. One more step. And it would no longer be in her hands. It would be in the hands of the very system she had called upon to act. And this time, that system came. An SUV marked with the Charlotte Internal Affairs Division pulled up to the entrance. The door opened, and out stepped a middle-aged woman in a deep blue blazer, holding a tablet, her eyes sharp but not harsh. She didn't need to introduce herself. Her face was familiar, seen often in news reports tied to the city's most prominent internal investigations, Senior Inspector Melissa Grant. Seconds later, another officer in a different uniform exited a second vehicle. 2 silver bars on his shoulder signaled his rank lieutenant. He entered the supermarket quickly, scanned the room, and locked eyes with Danielle. "Lieutenant Colonel Rivers?" he asked, his voice steady and respectful. Danielle nodded. "I'm the one who made the call." He returned the nod, then turned to Greg. And in that instant, everything turned. Greg's eyes froze. Confusion turned into panic. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. A store employee approached, holding a portable receipt printer, and quietly said to Inspector Grant, "We have footage too, if needed." Grant nodded, without taking her eyes off Greg. "We will need that. Thank you." The crowd began to murmur. But this time, it wasn't fear they were whispering. It was the sound of people stepping into the role of witnesses. Soft exchanges, expressions of awe, nods of agreement. A young man leaned toward his friend and said quietly, "She really did it." She stood her ground. Danielle didn't allow herself to feel swept up in the moment. She knew this was only the beginning. What came next would be even more difficult and would demand even greater strength. But she also knew the wind had shifted. Lieutenant Marcus Neal, having confirmed Danielle's identity, approached Greg. His voice dropped. "We've received a formal complaint. We have multiple witnesses and digital recordings. Until this matter is resolved, you are to hand over your badge and service weapon." Greg's eyes widened. "You can't be serious. Over this?" "She was provoking me," Grant interrupted, not loudly, but with words that landed like stone. "Officer Talbot, your behavior is being documented by civilians and recorded on more than 5 devices, not including store surveillance. This is not about provocation. This is about accountability." Greg clenched his fists. Danielle remained still. This was no longer her part to play. This was the system confronting the decay within itself. But she stood firm because her presence was a reminder. This wasn't an accident. This was consequence. An older woman stepped beside Danielle and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "I've seen things like this happen," she said softly, "but never thought I'd see one stopped." Danielle turned to her, her eyes softening. "Maybe now, we'll stop pretending it never happens." Greg was now being asked to surrender his badge and sidearm. He handed them over, slowly, as if hoping for a miracle to undo what was unfolding, but no one in that room hoped for that. And when the badge left his chest, it no longer symbolized authority, it marked the abuse of power stripped bare. Officers escorted Greg out of the store, while Grant continued gathering witness statements. There were no cheers, no applause, but the atmosphere had changed. It was the quiet exhale of a wound finally being bandaged with truth. Danielle stepped back slightly, standing near one of the aisles, placing her hand over her chest as if steadying her breath. No one clapped. But every eye turned to her not as a hero, but as a person who did the right thing when everyone else chose to stand still. No one could have predicted that a confrontation between 2 people in a supermarket would awaken an entire city. But the arrival of police vehicles, dozens of civilian eyes recording every moment, and a once intimidating officer now disarmed together turned what began as a small dispute into the eye of a justice storm. And then, just as the air inside the store grew taut as a violin string, the automatic doors opened once more. A tall man in a dark blue suit entered, flanked by 2 plainclothes security officers. No introduction was needed, no badge required. His face was familiar to everyone in the city. Mayor Henry Clarkson. He was known for his disdain of hollow speeches. In televised debates, he didn't hesitate to call out issues others avoided. Stern, disciplined, but fair. One of the rare local leaders who still held trust not just in documents, but in the hearts of his constituents. The supermarket held its breath. He paused at the entrance, his eyes scanning the crowd. A single glance was enough for him to understand what had transpired. Not because he saw the confrontation, but because he could feel the weight of justice hanging in the air, waiting for someone to step forward and name it. He walked toward the heart of the situation. People instinctively moved aside, like a silent wave clearing a path. Then his eyes met Danielle's. There was no shock, no hesitation, just recognition, as if he'd been expecting this moment all along. "Lieutenant Colonel Rivers?" he asked. his voice deep and clear as well. Danielle nodded, her expression unchanged, still calm, still steady, like someone who'd stood through storms. "Yes, Mr. Mayor," she replied. "I'm the one who made the call." He stopped, just one step in front of her, nodded slightly, then turned to Gregno standing off to the side, alone. No backup, no microphone. Just a man in uniform, stripped of his badge, stripped of power and with no excuse that could erase what had just unfolded. Mayor Clarkson didn't raise his voice. He didn't scold. He simply asked, "Do you have anything you'd like to say before I proceed?" Greg swallowed hard. His lips moved. Part of him wanted to defend himself. Another part knew that no words could rewrite what had been seen. His eyes scanned the crowd, hoping someone might come to his defense. But there was no one. Everyone was waiting to see what the mayor would do. I didn't think it would go this far," Greg stammered. "I was just doing my job." Clarkson neither nodded nor shook his head. He replied firmly, "Your job does not include disrespect, intimidation, or misuse of authority. That's not public service, that's public danger." Then he turned back to Danielle, his gaze softening slightly, still serious, but now carrying weight beyond protocol. "Colonel Rivers," he said, "on behalf of this city, I want to thank you not just for your service in uniform, but for your courage today. Not many would have done what you did." Danielle remained composed, but in her eyes, something flickered, not pride or relief. Relief that the right thing had finally been acknowledged by someone with power. "Thank you, sir," she replied. "But this wasn't about me. It's what kind of city we want to be." Clarkson nodded. "And what kind of people we choose to be when no one's watching." He turned to the investigation team, collecting evidence, and gave the order. "Suspend Officer Talbot immediately. Open an internal review. Collect all recordings from witnesses. And ensure we notify the Police Oversight Board before the end of today." As he finished speaking, the supermarket collectively exhaled. But it wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something greater. A middle-aged woman near the aisle began to cry. Not loudly, but the quiet weeping of someone who had been humiliated in silence, and now, finally, saw justice walk into the very place where she stood. A young man stepped toward Danielle, his phone still recording, and said gently, "We've got you on camera, ma'am, and we're posting this not for drama, but for truth." Danielle didn't respond. She simply nodded. She didn't need praise. She didn't need to be called a hero. All she wanted was for silence, to no longer be the only option for those who had been pushed aside. Greg was escorted out of the supermarket. No handcuffs, but his head no longer held high. Each step pulled his career further from the floor beneath him. And behind him, the eyes that followed weren't full of hate, they were full of memory. Remembering that once there was a man in uniform who didn't deserve it. Remembering that once there was a woman who stood for justice. And remembering that a city chose to rise instead of look away. But the ordeal still wasn't over. When Mayor Henry Clarkson ordered evidence to be collected and a formal investigation opened, Greg Talbot, the man who once strutted with arrogance, who once threatened and dismissed a woman simply because he assumed she stood alone, suddenly crumbled. His eyes grew panicked, sweat pooled in his palms, his body stiffened as if it wanted to react but was being pinned down by truth itself. Then, in a final effort to salvage whatever pride he had left, he stammered like a child, caught red-handed. "Sir, she misunderstood. I didn't mean anything. I didn't even raise my voice. It's being twisted." Mayor Clarkson didn't need to hear the rest. He raised a hand, stopping him with a firm but not violent gesture. Just that simple motion was enough to silence Greg completely. The mayor's gaze now burned like steel pulled from fire, sharp, cold, and merciless. "You disrespected a senior military officer and a citizen in front of an entire community," he said, each word falling like iron onto the supermarket floor. "There is no misunderstanding here, only misconduct." The entire store froze. Even the children clung to their parents, silent not out of fear, but because they knew, instinctively, they were witnessing real justice. Not in a movie, not in theory, but right here, in front of them. Greg flinched and turned toward a nearby officer, eyes silently pleading. But the officer didn't move his face, showing clear disappointment. No one stood up for Greg. No system shielded him. He had lost the one thing every uniformed figure must possess: trust. "Officer Talbot," Clarkson said, his voice unchanging, "hand over your badge and firearm, immediately." Greg looked stunned. His mouth opened, but no words came. In his eyes was a new kind of fear, not fear of punishment, but fear of having nowhere left to hide. Whispers rippled through the store. Phones turned back on, capturing the moment. A woman near the deli whispered, "This is the first time I've seen justice happen in real time." A man exhaled. "No more hiding behind the badge." Greg slowly reached up to unpin his badge, his hand shaking. His face had gone pale. Every movement was sluggish, as if time itself was trying to hold him accountable. When the badge left his chest and landed in Lieutenant Marcus Neal's hand, no one spoke. That silence was its own verdict. Next came his firearm, the symbol of his enforcement authority. Greg unstrapped it and placed it in the officer's hand, as if one more ounce would make him collapse. Clarkson didn't raise his voice, nor did he whisper. He spoke just loud enough for everyone to hear. "You were trusted to serve, not to intimidate. Your badge was never meant to shield you from consequence. Consider yourself relieved of duty, pending full investigation." Greg stood frozen. Gone was the glare of a man who had once threatened Danielle. Gone was the confidence built on hollow power. All that remained was emptiness, the kind left behind when arrogance finally collapses in on itself. Danielle remained still, her hands gently folded in front of her. She didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't revel in victory. Because for her, this wasn't about confrontation. It was a moment proving that a society still hungry for integrity had just taken a step forward. A nearby citizen stepped up, handing the mayor a phone with a video that had captured everything from the start. Clarkson took it, eyes fixed on the screen. He nodded once, then spoke quietly. "This evidence will be preserved and reviewed. Thank you for doing what's right." Greg, no longer a police officer, just a man whose misdeeds had been exposed, was escorted out of the store. No handcuffs, no drama. But every eye followed him not out of hatred, but because they had to remember. Remember that once there was a man in uniform who did not deserve it. Remember that once there was a woman who stood for justice. And remember that a city chose to rise, instead of look away. Clarkson turned to Danielle. His expression softened, no longer sharp with tension, but heavy with purpose. His voice lowered not from anger, but from responsibility. "Charlotte owes you a debt, Colonel Rivers. Not just for today, but for every day you stood your ground when others didn't." Danielle gave a slight nod. She claimed no credit. She simply said, softly but powerfully, "I didn't stand for myself. I stood for everyone who was too tired, too scared, or too unheard to stand up." And that sentence, it wasn't a closing line. It was the beginning of something far greater. Clarkson pulled out his phone and called the chief of police. He didn't waste time. When the line picked up, he said only two things. "You saw what happened. I want a review of our training protocols and a full audit on internal complaints, starting tomorrow." He ended the call. No grandstanding, no media statements. But everyone understood the system had been shaken. And this time, it wouldn't go back to what it was. But the ordeal still wasn't over. After Mayor Clarkson's decisive order, the atmosphere inside the supermarket transformed into something hard to define, heavy with history, but burning with hope. It was a moment when justice, once thought distant and buried in textbooks, suddenly came alive in the aisles, between shopping carts, and in the eyes of people long used to bowing their heads. Greg Talbot stood frozen under the weight of stares, whispers, and irrefutable evidence. At least 10 phones had captured everything. From his first mocking remark to his blatant threats, and finally his frantic unraveling in the face of truth. An investigator from Internal Affairs stepped forward, moving carefully as though each step carried the weight of the facts. "We'll need copies of all recordings," she said, scanning the crowd. "Any witness willing to give a statement, please step forward." No one spoke at first. But then, like a slow-moving domino, people began to step up. A mother pushing a cart, her child asleep in her arms, said, "I saw everything." She never raised her voice. He did. An older man, his face lined with years of quiet knowing, added, "We've had problems like him before, but nobody ever stood up to them like this." And a teenager, barely 20, raised his phone and said quietly, "I got it all, start to finish." Videos and witness statements were gathered. USB drives were plugged into laptops. Audio files were marked and categorized. No more shadows, no more ambiguity. The truth now had shape, sound, and living witnesses. Greg didn't resist. He said nothing. His eyes stared off into the distance, as if trying to retrace how he ended up here. But it no longer mattered. Every door to denial had closed. And when two officers approached Stone, placing a guiding hand, the other opening the exit, Greg didn't struggle. He walked, slowly, each step weighted with the collapse of his career. And then, as the doors of the supermarket opened and Greg was led outside, applause broke out. Not hesitant, not fragmented. A wave of clapping erupted, sustained, growing like the sound of years of silence finally shattering into a chorus of release. It wasn't applause for the fall of a man. It was applause for the rise of fairness. For the woman who refused to stay silent. For the mayor who didn't look away. And for the crowd itself, because they had just rediscovered their faith in justice. Danielle didn't turn. She didn't smile. She didn't raise a hand. She simply stood there, eyes steady and solemn as they had been since the beginning. She wasn't proud. She wasn't triumphant. Because she knew this wasn't victory, it was duty. A store employee approached her, eyes glassy, voice trembling. "I've worked here 6 years. I've seen him treat people bad before, but no one ever dared say anything." Danielle didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at the woman for a long moment, then nodded. A nod not of pride, but of shared burden, a silent reply that said, "I know, I've seen, and I couldn't stay silent anymore." A child walked up around 8 years old. He looked up at Danielle and suddenly raised his hand in a crisp military salute. Danielle paused. In his eyes was pure admiration. She nodded slightly, returning the salute in the same precise way she'd done thousands of times in uniform. And just like that, the child turned and ran back to his mother, shouting, "She's like a superhero." Danielle wasn't a superhero. She was real. A woman who had once been dismissed. A soldier who'd once stood alone in the ranks. A human being who had once believed she might not have the strength to rise again. But today, she had done what needed to be done, not to win, but because losing to injustice was no longer an option. Clarkson stepped beside her, his voice now softened not with hesitation, but with the gravity of someone who had just witnessed a turning point. "They'll remember today, Colonel, not just what happened, but how it ended." Danielle didn't look at him. She simply said, gently as breath, "Let's make sure this isn't the end, but the beginning." No one expected that a small confrontation in a supermarket could ripple across an entire city in less than 24 hours. But what happened at Meadow Hill Market was no longer just about an officer and a woman. It had become a symbol of power, dignity, and the fragile line between duty and abuse. That same day, just hours after the incident, Greg Talbot was officially suspended. True to his promise of transparency, Mayor Clarkson held an emergency press conference at City Hall at 6 p.m. In front of the media and community representatives, he stated plainly, "Public service is a sacred trust. When that trust is broken, the people deserve answers and action." Effective immediately, Officer Greg Talbot is suspended without pay, pending full investigation. The news spread like wildfire. Local stations aired special reports, including the full video of the confrontation between Danielle and Greg. In less than 4 hours, the clip had racked up over 1.2 million views on social media. Hashtags like #Justice in Charlotte, #Danielle Rivers, and #Accountability Now began trending. But what was even more telling, it reopened old wounds long buried in silence. A woman named Keisha Turner, a former cashier at a nearby store where Greg once patrolled, posted a heartfelt message. "Last year, Greg stopped me just for taking out the trash through the back door. He demanded to search my garbage bag without reason. When I questioned him, he threatened to arrest me for interfering with law enforcement. I cried from shame. But today, I saw light in the woman wearing that uniform. Thank you." One voice became many. Within 48 hours, over 13 official complaints were filed against Greg Talbot for abuse of power, threats, or verbal harassment, most from Black residents, working-class citizens, or single mothers. A 17-year-old boy recounted on live television, his voice shaking. "He once pulled me aside because I was riding my bike without a helmet. I apologized, but he cursed at me, grabbed my collar like I was a criminal." The host, usually composed, paused silently before continuing. Charlotte's Internal Affairs launched a formal investigation. Inspector Melissa Grant was appointed to lead an independent review. She pledged to examine every behavioral report, patrol log, and filed complaint related to Greg Talbot over the past 7 years. Meanwhile, affected neighborhoods began hosting open forums with local officials, law enforcement, and legal experts. At a packed meeting in Eastfield Community Center, over 300 residents gathered. A gray-haired man spoke. Danielle Rivers didn't just stand for herself. She held up a mirror showing us how often we've chosen silence. National media picked up the story. The Washington Post headlined, "Lieutenant Colonel takes stand against police abuse and wins." CNN aired an 8-minute feature interviewing Mayor Clarkson and eyewitnesses from the store. And through it all, Danielle Rivers remained absent from the spotlight. She declined talk shows, turned down personal interviews. When asked why, she replied simply, "I won't turn doing the right thing into a PR stunt. Justice isn't a brand. It's something we're supposed to protect even if no one's watching." Still, her actions sparked a chain reaction. Several local universities updated their civic ethics curriculums. The Charlotte Police Academy hosted an internal seminar titled "Power and Boundaries Lessons from the Talbot Case." A young law student posted, "I used to think I'd go into corporate law. After that video, I know my path is fighting for those no one listens to." In a leaked internal memo, the police chief admitted, "We overlooked too many warning signs." But this time, the city has spoken. Attached was a directive to begin department-wide personnel reviews, quarterly community behavior audits, and mandatory psychological assessments for all officers. As for Greg, after suspension, he was summoned to a closed disciplinary hearing. He sat with his head lowered, expressionless. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses testified, one after another. No shadows remained. No loopholes left. 3 weeks later, the city of Charlotte issued a final statement. Greg Talbot was permanently terminated, and his case referred to the district attorney for criminal investigation on charges of abuse of authority and threats against civilians. The community didn't celebrate. They didn't gloat, but they exhaled a breath they had held for far too long. And at a city council meeting, when asked what the administration planned to do to prevent this from happening again, Mayor Clarkson turned to the camera and said simply, "We'll do what she did, stand up." No one imagined that a quiet act in a supermarket would transform an entire city. But as the dust settled, in the ashes of a once silent system, the image of Danielle Rivers standing firm in the face of injustice became a force more powerful than any media campaign could ever craft. Danielle never asked to be a hero. In the days that followed, as reporters swarmed, she withdrew to her base and resumed her duties as before. She declined exclusive interviews, turned down sensational headlines, and never once used the media spotlight for personal gain. "Why would I speak about justice?" she once said to a fellow officer, "when justice should be everyone's job." not mine alone. But even if she didn't seek it, society began to see her as a moral compass. And then came the first invitation from an unexpected place, the National Military Academy. They asked her to speak at their annual Ethics and Leadership Forum before an audience of over 1,000 cadets, senior officers, and international guests. Danielle spent an entire night thinking it over before accepting. She knew if she stayed silent again, it would undo the very silence she once dared to break. On stage, she didn't read a script. She walked out in a pressed uniform, sharp eyes, and a voice low but heavy with purpose. "Respect isn't given by uniform," she said. "It's earned by action." The auditorium fell silent. But not from tension, from understanding. Danielle didn't recount her story with emotion. She spoke with facts, with social consequences, and with what she had seen in the eyes of those people that day, disappointment that had lasted years, and a hope that had finally risen at the right moment. "Don't ask what people owe you because you wear a badge," she said, locking eyes with the front row of senior officers. "Ask if your presence makes them feel safe or afraid. That is the only evaluation that matters." After her speech, no one left their seat right away. A retired general walked up, shook her hand, and whispered, "You reminded us what command truly means. Thank you." But Danielle only bowed her head. For her, praise didn't fix what had happened. Only what came next would matter. Word of her speech spread quickly. Police training centers in multiple states began reevaluating their programs. The first to change was the North Carolina Police Academy, where Greg had trained a decade earlier. They added a new module: Power and Self, Reflection in Law Enforcement. In the first session, the instructor played the footage from Meadow Hill Market, not to shame Greg, but to analyze how a society reacts when its trust is tested. Then came Illinois. Then California. Academy after academy began introducing mandatory courses on community ethics, racial bias response, and critically how to handle citizen dissent with dignity. Soon after, Danielle was appointed as an honorary advisor to Charlotte's newly formed Civilian Oversight Board. She held no formal power, but her voice served as a constant reminder. No one should stand alone when telling the truth. She attended community meetings. No slogans, no blame, just listening and taking notes. To her, change didn't come from podiums. It came from hearing the people who had been quiet for far too long. One day, a high school student emailed her, "I never believed in justice, but after watching that video, I've decided to study law. Not to protect the powerful, but to give a voice to the overlooked." Danielle read it and replied with just one line, "Then never stop listening." Soon after, she was invited to speak at the opening ceremony for the city's police academy. This time, she stood before 500 new recruits, many of whom had watched the footage of her confrontation with Greg. She looked at them and said slowly, "Every time you wear that uniform, ask yourself, does my presence bring peace or fear? If it's fear, take it off. You're not ready." The hall fell silent. A female cadet stood, raised her hand, and asked, "What kept you calm that day, ma'am?" Danielle smiled softly, a tired smile, but not a broken one. "I wasn't calm. I was clear. There's a difference. When you know who you are, they can't take it from you." No one imagined that an unshaken gaze in a supermarket could become a symbol for an entire generation. But with injustice exposed and justice delivered, something new had begun, a movement, not born from noise, but from awakening. Danielle Rivers knew if it ended with applause or conference speeches, her action would become just another moment. But society didn't need another moment. It needed a movement. So, not long after stepping down from the stage at the city's police academy, Danielle, along with a group of retired officers, civil rights attorneys, and community advocates, launched a campaign called Stand with Integrity. No flashy slogans, no complex branding, just a simple white circle surrounding two words: integrity first. The message Danielle chose to begin the campaign was etched onto every poster, website, and video clip. Power should protect, not oppress. One sentence, but it was a sentence she had lived heartbeat by heartbeat that day, and now she carried it everywhere as a quiet reminder. Power is not a privilege. It is a responsibility. She started with schools where the foundations of fairness are built long before uniforms are worn. At Franklin High School, she stood before more than 800 students. She didn't speak about herself. She spoke about choice. Every day, she said, you'll be handed a moment to stay silent or speak, to bow or stand, to accept or to challenge. Don't wait until you wear a badge to learn ethics. Start today. She extended her hand, inviting students onto the Stagionot to speak, but to write a pledge on a whiteboard. I will never stay silent when I witness injustice. From high schools, the campaign reached law schools. At Duke University's School of Law, Danielle participated in a student-led forum with state police leaders. The topic: the line between power and human rights. She didn't lecture. She simply recalled the moment Greg said, "You're just a woman, mind your business," and how a society once silent stood together and rose. A senior law student, son of a state judge, spoke during the Q&A. "Your story made me realize law shouldn't be learned to wield. It should be learned to protect. From now on, I'll study not just to be sharper, but to be more principled." The movement soon expanded beyond professional circles. Black communities in major cities from Charlotte to Atlanta, from Oakland to Chicago began holding integrity gatherings, where people shared stories of past abuse, past fear. And in every gathering, a shared message rang clear. We don't need to shout to be heard, we just need to stand. A 12-year-old girl, named Malia, from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, asked her mother for permission to write Danielle a letter. In it, she wrote, "I used to be scared when my friend was bullied, because her skin was darker than mine. But I stood up not to fight, just to tell my teacher, it's not okay. And today, she asked me to be class president. You made me believe standing up isn't about winning, it's about being right." Danielle received that letter during a community relations meeting at the Charlotte Police Department. She didn't speak. She just held the letter, reread it, then gently placed her hand over her heart as if the little girl's words were a thread holding her steady through the weight of change. The media called Danielle the silent reformer, someone who sparked transformation not through outrage, but through ethical clarity. Time published a feature titled, "She Stood So Others Wouldn't Have to Fall." She was awarded Honorary Citizen of the Year 2025 by the American Justice Association. But when interviewed, she said just one thing: "Don't give me a medal. Give it to the people learning to say no even when no one's filming." And indeed, cities began to shift. Some counties launched anonymous misconduct reporting apps for civilians. Emotional intelligence and power responsibility courses became mandatory for new officers. Small steps, but real ones. In her free moments, Danielle returned to her base, sitting alone at her desk, rereading emails from students, teachers, veterans, single mothers, street vendors. She didn't need them to remember her name. She only hoped they remembered the feeling of being respected and the courage to hold on to it. Once, when asked what message she'd leave for the next generation, Danielle said only this: "Integrity is when no one claps. No one thanks. And you still choose to do what's right." But the ordeal wasn't truly over, not because there were more battles to fight, but because the truth remained. Societal wounds cannot be healed by a verdict or a single speech. Danielle Rivers understood that better than anyone, and that's why, when the cameras shut off, the applause faded, and the headlines moved on, she stayed. She no longer appeared in the media. No more forums, no morning talk shows. She returned to base, resumed training, mentoring, and serving quietly just as she always had. At Fort Bragg, the very base she first stepped into as a second lieutenant, she now walked the training halls, greeting young officers with eyes both stern and warm. She didn't preach. She simply asked, "Are you ready to lead?" Because that means being ready to answer for every choice, even the silent ones. Her peers called her The quiet compass, never loud, never lenient. But anyone who had ever served under her remembered one thing: her integrity never negotiated. One Saturday morning, during a civil military tactics class, she pointed to the board and wrote, "Justice isn't a moment. It's a commitment." A cadet asked, "Ma'am, does that mean we always have to speak up?" Danielle paused, then replied, "Number, it means you never stop listening, and when the moment comes, you'll know what silence costs." On quiet nights, when she had no duty shift or drills, she would sit alone, reading, or making notes on policy reform reports. No one asked her to, but she knew responsibility doesn't end when the event fades. It simply changes form. The Stand with Integrity campaign continued independently, maintained by volunteers she had never met. Yet they still sent her regular updates, not to seek approval, but to keep a promise that what she began would not be forgotten. One December day, she received a handwritten letter from a first-year cadet. He wrote, "Before I saw your video, I thought strength came from commands. After hearing you speak, I realized real strength is using power to lift others, not push them down." She read the letter, folded it, and placed it in the personal box where she kept special notes, not for their words, but for the change they symbolized. She didn't need to be remembered by name. She only wanted to be remembered as the first hand that dared to lift hope from the rubble. At a military summit where she was invited as an honorary guest but declined to speak, she submitted only one short note. "Don't ask who's right or wrong. Ask who will act when no one else dares, and then be that person." That quote now appears printed against a deep Navy wall in the main hall of the Charlotte Military Academy. Cadets walk past it every day. And from those very halls, a new generation is rising, not with volume, but with an understanding of virtue. She once said she wasn't a hero. She never sought attention. But the truth is, the steps she took that day through a crowded supermarket, her eyes unshaken, her voice unwavering, sparked a wave of change that could not be undone, not just in policy, but deeper still in the minds of thousands, students, police, soldiers, and single mothers who once cried in silence. Danielle deeply understood what many struggle to accept. Justice isn't a highlight to be broadcast. It is a quiet vow, repeated, often unseen. And she was willing to live a lifetime holding that vow, not for praise, but to leave the world slightly better than the day before. One morning, she walked across the training yard, the flag flapping lightly in the breeze. A new recruit ran up and saluted. She returned the salute and softly said, "Keep your boots clean and your conscience cleaner." Then she walked on steady, silent each step, a quiet reminder to this generation. Integrity doesn't need to shout. It only needs to never stop. Danielle Rivers never wanted to be a hero. She only wanted to do what was right. But her calm in the storm, her integrity in the silence, and her courage in the face of injustice made her a symbol of our time. She understood that justice isn't a moment caught on camera, it's a quiet commitment, repeated day after day. And if there's one thing she hoped we would remember, it's this: power doesn't define who we are, how we use it does. So if you ever find yourself standing before injustice, don't wait for someone else to lead the way. Remember, every brave step you take today could become the legacy that changes tomorrow. If this story moved you, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. We tell these stories so you'll never feel the need to stay silent again.